when we think about still life, we think about conventional setups that are a lot like this. And this is Edward Vuillard, and he worked primarily in the late 19th century. He was very interested in pattern. He was very influenced by Japanese printmaking. But when we think about what a still life does, it is a focus that essentially puts the domestic on display. And so when we think of conventional representations of still life, I think most of us think of images like this. A bouquet of flowers, a tabletop, right? It's very much what you would see in your home. So what my job to do today is to show you a variety of still lifes so that we don't feel entirely stifled, because many, many artists have changed the way they investigate the still life in order to challenge the conventions that have been set before from artists like this. So a more contemporary version, right? It's still sort of mimetic of the domestic space. However, you see that this is set up on the floor. It's probably in the studio. This is not the way you would set up your, your fruit and, jug of water at home on a floor underneath a table, right? So we begin to see the theatrical implications of what the still life is away from the actual domestic space. Dartmouth Kelly paints fairly domestic subject, but for the most part, they're painted in such a way that they really do illustrate light. He actually paints in a box, in a big box room that he made so he could completely control the light so it never changes. He paints from direct observation entirely. And so we still see this sort of iteration of the domestic, at least in the setup, even though they get a little bit more bald and a little bit more highly saturated in light. So here's a contemporary artist, Ignacy Monreal. This is an artist who is playing with the format of an icon painting, right, from like the 1500s, a religious painting. But we see much more contemporary subjects. This is a body of work that this artist did in conjunction with Gucci, the fashion brand. And so you'll see this sort of product placement in the images, specifically in the lower right-hand corner, which are those Gucci wallets, which is sort of gross. But what it does is it engages the fashion world with the visual art world in a way that really does sort of re-script how branding and product placement play a role in the way we think about beauty, and the way we think about the domestic, and the way we think about brands. Stephanie Pierce is a painter who I believe she's still at University of Arkansas. She leads the painting program there. I believe she may have moved on, I don't know. And she works entirely from direct observation as well, but she really does straddle the line between abstraction and representation. And she does that through the mass of subjects, like the noise of the foliage and the noise of the pattern, but also through cropping and the inclusion of the interior space itself. So it's still domestic, but it becomes unconventional in the way that it's composed and the amount of information that's there. Fabio Gales, I think that's how you pronounce it, did a series entirely of offal. Offal is the interior organs of animals that have been butchered that you can eat. Many people do across the world. If you eat sausage, it's in there for sure. And he hung them suspended in clear plastic bags to paint them. Is it still life? Absolutely. Is it conventional? In subject it is. Lots and lots of still lifes throughout the past have included meat, sides of beef, fish, all the things that we would normally eat. However, this is made grotesque. So hopefully you listen to the Still Life 1 and 2, or watch the Still Life 1 and 2 lectures, which is on your board there, over to the left, on Painting 1. If you didn't, you will get what I'm talking about. You won't get what I'm talking about. Oh, that's a Dartmouth Kelly, and that is out of order. So when I'm thinking of asking a student to do a complex still life, sometimes that might actually include the context. So even though the subject here, these beets, I think they're beets, could easily be painted in a very short amount of time, this setup essentially uses what's around the focal point as a means to contextualize and embed the subject itself. So it's complex in its compositional arrangement, but it's also complex in that it's a more complicated image to look at, right, and create. So I would consider this definitely a complex still life. Christopher Gallego does some really unconventional subjects. So I've got two of his images in this lecture. And of course, here we have the stack of windows, which are not necessarily appealing or your prototypic subject to include in a still life. However, he does beautiful things with colored grays and reflection and white. So here's another one of his paintings, just simply a roll of plastic, clear plastic, in a corner in his studio. So it really is a meditation on grays. They're very atmospheric, they're very beautiful. They are definitely not subject matter that one would think of to immediately put into a still life. Aaron Thompson, why is it complex? It utilizes a kind of three-point perspective, presuming that the viewer or him is very, very high while, high up, looking down at a still life made essentially with foil and plaster, right? The setup in the studio itself. So is it conventional? Yeah, not really, but kinda. And it is because it's a still life on a table, but it's a table that's painted in such a severe way that you can't help but think about perspective. And it's plaster and foil, which are not necessarily things that you would automatically go to. It could be simply as easy as multiple fairly difficult forms, right? It could be something as simple as that. I do not know the name of this artist, sorry. Janet Fish was somebody I was hugely influenced by when I was in undergrad. I was primarily a still life painter in undergrad until a little later. And she's really interested in, you would not call her a photorealist. And she works primarily from direct observation, not from photography. She's interested in reflective shapes and forms. Susanna Coffey, I met her when I was in undergrad. We went to her studio. She teaches at the Art Institute of Chicago. And she's actually known for self-portraits, but she does still lifes as well. And what makes this interesting and unconventional is that it's monumentalizing a very simple subject, right? So it becomes then a meditation of the meaning of the still life itself, rather than the sort of blasé conventionality of it. So it is essentially a memento mori. Harold Redcliffe, another meditation on grays, is using the studio wall and art supplies as a means to create an interesting composition. And that interesting composition is so barren of high contrast that it sort of feels abstract, right? Like a hard-edged geometric abstraction. Jonathan Clark, again, another meditation on whites and grays. Why is it conventional? Because half of the still life has nothing in it. It's the underside of the table, and it's the white of the wall. So it's a play on the positioning of the focal point. And we only have one colored object in the entire thing. Gwen Wicker just does fairly complex setups that are clearly in the studio. You see all the stretcher bars and the easels in the background. Peter Van Dyke makes these really beautiful atmospheric and colored light paintings. They're all done from direct observation as well. And I think they're very beautiful in terms of how he uses highlight. I want you to notice how little white there is actually in this painting. It's yellow that he's using to lift the lights out. And it creates a really beautiful, consistent light source of the space itself. Another Peter Van Dyke. So what makes it unconventional? Well, the fact that it includes a context. You see the windows, you see the backyard behind it, You see the lights. So it's a stacking of space. And usually still lifes only have a very simple space, one that is shallow, that doesn't necessarily deal with fore, middle, and background. So that's an option as well. And then Scott Noel. Scott Noel is the last artist that I'll show. And he's very conventional in terms of academic painting. He makes very richly colored, beautiful images that are sort of like washed out in light, but not washed out in color. And I would call this unconventional because it clearly is a sort of theatric setup that he's done in his studio. This is definitely not the way we would live, although they're all things that we could easily find in our kitchen. Sometimes he'll play with like perspective in a way that makes me question his choices, but such as the bottom part of the front table. But they're very sort of pastel colored. A lot of his work is incredibly pastel. But the neutral grays, look at that background. It's not a white wall. It's a baby blue gray, it's a lavender gray, and then it's a deeper blue gray. Gray can do beautiful things. It can neutralize your subject, but it can do wonderful things in terms of description of space. So, you're going to create a complex still life painting that creates a balanced, harmonious composition. You're going to use several objects or a complex setting, one or the other, or both, for your arrangement. Use an artist showcase in the PowerPoint as the conceptual and aesthetic foundation for your setup. You do not have to use the same objects, however. Okay, you can use anything that we've got in here, anything in my office, anything you want. Anything that you've got at home, doesn't matter to me. Perform the research on said artist and save the image that you will base your composition on. You will introduce that in the next assignment, or in the next critique. Your painting must be over 18 by 24 in scale or so, and will be reflective of 2 weeks worth of work. You'll have a whole 2 weeks with this. So next week you'll come in and you'll be working on this painting. Okay? You won't just have a week for it. You'll be awarded points based on your composition, the level of finish, and surface handling. What do I mean by that? I think we talked about it very clearly in the crit, where we talk about how everything on the surface is treated the same way, and it's built up to such a degree of finish that we do not question the choices that you made with how you handled the paint. Does that make sense? Adequate representation of a full value range. There are artists who make very light, very shallow value ranges. As long as it's consistent throughout and it appears as though it's a choice, that can be fine. So that's why I say adequate representation of a full value range. So not all of you are high contrast, nor do I expect you to be. Your use of color, your visual acuity, how well you've seen, your craftsmanship, and of course your ambition. Because now we're building, and you're starting to focus on your own voice here. Are there any questions that I can include in the recording here that you might have?
I have 16 by 24.
That's fine. 16 by 20 works fine. I think I did tell you 16 by 20. I just couldn't remember. Yeah?
What if we pick the same artist as someone else? Is that okay?
Yeah, it's totally fine that you pick the same artist as someone else. Any other questions? No?